This is Dream Power Radio, the place where your dreams turn into reality. Here is your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman.
Hello, and welcome to Dream Power Radio. I'm your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman, the Dream Coach. This is a show where we talk about dreams, both daytime and nighttime dreams, and how you can use them to make the internal shift to a life you love and rediscover the truth of who you really are. We may be looking at the pandemic through the rearview mirror now, at least most of us are, but it's left a devastating scar in its wake, a sharp rise in mental health issues. Suicide rates have reached an all-time high this year alone, and there have been equally high increases in depression, anxiety, and burnout. For many people, it's the first time they've had to deal with these uneasy feelings, and their inability to handle them only makes them feel worse and leads to added stress, decreased self-esteem, lack of sleep, and even health problems. And no one can even think of living their dream life when confronted with issues like these. But as with any problem, there is a solution. And we're going to talk about one of those methods with my guest, Stanford School of Medicine professor, Dr. Greg Hammer. Dr. Hammer is a physician, mindfulness expert, and the author of the book, Gain Without Pain, the Happiness Handbook for Healthcare Professionals. And we're happy to have him back on Dream Power Radio. So welcome back, Dr. Greg.
Great to be with you, Debbie.
Oh, it is my pleasure. And it is kind of an important subject to talk about because there are a lot of stressed out people out there, Greg. So why are more people struggling with this more than ever?
Debbie, as we all recognize, life itself is stressful. So I think that we all endure chronic stress to a varying degree. Under the best of circumstances, we are concerned about, distracted with our mortality, illness. We have all lost loved ones. Our jobs are sometimes a matter of insecurity, a matter of fatigue. And then you superimpose upon that everything that's going on in the world. You mentioned COVID, and many people still suffer from COVID, not just the scar of COVID past, but COVID present. And I've certainly been very fortunate myself. I know what people are going through. I have not contracted COVID yet, and I hope that I don't. But my significant other is sequestered with COVID as we speak, and she's been vaccinated and boosted, but she still got quite ill. And her daughter, and we all normally live together, she is now sequestered in another location, and her daughter is sequestered mostly in her room because I've had a bug as well, COVID negative. So the thing is ongoing, and now we're worried about monkeypox. And so if you superimpose the COVID dilemma upon our usual baseline amount of stress, and then I think just the stress and horror that's reverberating around the world, in Ukraine, for example, and people who suffer in the economy. And I just finished reading a wonderful book on healthcare and how many of us are uninsured in our wealthy nation. And so there's just a lot of things to be chronically stressed about. And we all suffer, I think, in general from that chronic stress.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that a second and get a definition from you. Is there a difference between what we call chronic stress and stress that may come about from like a single particular incident, maybe a traumatic incident or something that is above or beyond just the regular normal life, and somebody who maybe doesn't usually feel stress will have it come on? Is there a difference between that and the stress that's kind of long term?
Well, I think we can talk about acute stress and chronic stress. Acute stress may be adaptive, actually. It's sort of the flight or fight or freeze response. So we hear a splash at a party with a swimming pool, and a toddler has fallen in the pool, and our heart rate goes up, our blood pressure goes up, the adrenaline in our body increases, and that helps actually prepare us for jumping in the pool and saving the toddler. But when that stress lasts more than a short period of time, and I would say hours, it becomes chronic stress. And that elevation in adrenaline, excuse me, hormonal changes, other changes in our body that are adverse in response to that chronic stress are maladaptive. And so I think, as you mentioned, we all have a certain degree of chronic stress. And when acute stress is superimposed on that, that can really add to our chronic stress. So I think that when we lose a loved one or we face some other stressful situation that lasts for more than a few hours, it really adds to and amplifies our chronic stress and its adverse effects.
Okay, I want to talk about the different types of stresses that people suffer from, and something that certainly became a lot more in the news as a result of people's work situations was burnout. So what are some of the symptoms of burnout?
Sure. Well, we're talking about chronic stress, and chronic stress leads to burnout in many cases. And burnout is simply mental and physical, emotional fatigue, which is caused by chronic stress. And the signs and symptoms of that are evident. We all recognize it when we see it. We go to work. Typically, maybe at the end of the day, we get a little impatient with our colleagues. We're eager to get home. And when we're chronically stressed and becoming somewhat burnt out, that impatience, that reactivity happens earlier and earlier in the day. And then sometimes it's to the point where we arrive at work and we immediately feel like we want to leave, and we have impatience with our colleagues and so on. We're snappy, we're irritable. So that's burnout. It's the result of chronic stress leading to physical and emotional fatigue.
And then how would you define anxiety?
Well, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I think anxiety is a matter of distraction with the future. Oftentimes, it could be the past. And when we dwell excessively on the future and the past, we catastrophize. We have a negativity bias. We tend to remember the negative and forget the positive. And when we stress and overthink the future, for example, in a maladaptive way, that brings fear and anxiety because we imagine the worst things that could happen, even though it's very unlikely that those things will ever happen. But we get stuck in this very negative feedback loop when we overthink the future and what may transpire going forward. And I think that leads to this state of anxiety where we're just feeling nervous and agitated, and we can't get out of our heads. We get stuck in this self-propagating feedback loop of thinking about the worst thing that may happen going forward.
So all of this really is, as you said, maladaptive thinking. It's the thinking that is causing all of these reactions and just basic reactions to things that go on in our lives. So what would be the first way to combat that? Instead of talking about the symptoms, talk about the solutions to the stress and anxiety.
Sure. I think we're all a little bit tired of talking about the signs and symptoms of chronic stress that all of us experience to one degree or another. And it's time to really start focusing on the solutions, as you suggested. I always go back to my very basic principles. And GAIN is an acronym for gratitude, acceptance, intention, and non-judgment. And I think these really are the four pillars of happiness. And as you mentioned, we are very distracted in maladaptive ways by the future and the past. It's adaptive to think about the future to the extent that we plan for good times, we make preparations to put bread on the table, as it were. It's adaptive to think about the past to the extent that we learn from our mistakes and we savor our wonderful memories. But beyond that, overthinking the past and the future leads to this state where we're chronically stressed. And happiness, on the other hand, is really in the present moment. So the question is, how can we bring ourselves back to the present moment? And how can we turn this negativity bias into a positivity bias? And the good news is that our brains have this wonderful quality called neuroplasticity. So instead of having these negative thoughts and this excessive thinking about the future and the past in ways that are maladaptive, we can embrace a practice that gradually, little by little, in baby steps, rewires our brain to be more present and more positive.
Greg, your program is called GAIN, and GAIN is actually an acronym for 4 pillars that it represents. So I like to do a little deep dive into that. So tell us what the G is for.
The G is for gratitude. And again, we're talking about happiness and how to be present and how to be positive. And gratitude, I think we all recognize, is an essential part of happiness. We can imagine being poor and yet happy. We can imagine being disabled physically and happy. But you can't really imagine somebody being happy and ungrateful. So gratitude helps bring us back to the present. It helps rewire our brains to become more positive. And I think it's the basis of many practices, if you will, this gratitude practice, whether we simply go to it in our thoughts, whether we journal that for which we're grateful. It doesn't really matter. I'm not a journaler, but of course, many people are. And I think journaling and writing about one's gratitude on a daily basis, if possible, is wonderful. So gratitude, again, is the first and foremost and essential ingredient in happiness.
I tell you, I will second that wholeheartedly. In fact, I've said this on the show that gratitude actually helped me cope with the pandemic. I've been fortunate. I live in a really beautiful part of the country, and I tend to take things like that for granted. But I made a point of really being aware of where I was, feeling incredibly grateful that I was here and not in this little apartment in a city surrounded by a whole bunch of people. I'm out in the country and in plenty of fresh air, and it was a great place to be at the time. And that got me through. So, yeah, I think any way you can find gratitude, and anybody can come up with several things that they're grateful for, even if their world is horrible. There's something going on in their world that's good that they could be grateful for.
Absolutely. I mean, things could always be worse. So, my right knee is hurting, but my left knee is great. We should be grateful. If we're intending to be present and positive, we should be grateful for the bounties in our life, for people that we love and hopefully love us in return. And just for this breath, if that doesn't bring you right to the present moment, then perhaps nothing will. So yes, gratitude is a key essential ingredient to happiness.
Okay. And then step 2 starts with the letter A, as in GA. So tell me about that.
A is acceptance, because we can't ignore the pain in our lives. Pain is inevitable, as hopefully is joy. So, in fact, they may be sort of proportionate. So we all have pain, and it's a matter of how we deal with that pain that determines to what extent we suffer. And there's a formula in the book, Debbie, that is suffering equals pain times resistance. So the pain is there, the loss of a loved one. I, for example, lost my beautiful son at the age of 29, 5 years ago. So that pain is there. We've all experienced pain at various levels. If we resist it, we suffer more. If we pretend it didn't happen, or if we really try not to think about it, and I'm not proposing that we think about painful things all the time, but at some point, and during our GAIN meditation is the right time, we actually, with our eyes closed, we're in touch with our breath. We're breathing slowly and deeply. We've been through that for which we're grateful. We direct our thoughts to acceptance. And that is, we identify this pain and we actually envision our chest opening and our heart opening. And we bring this pain closer and closer until it's in our heart, until we've merged with it, until there's no separation. And if we ask ourselves the question, can I live with this pain forever? The answer becomes yes. So we fully accept this. And I sometimes think of Jesus on the cross with these stakes through his hands and feet. Of course, he was in a lot of pain, but I imagine that he accepted the pain fully, that he ceased resisting it at all. And therefore, his suffering was diminished, or perhaps it even dissipated altogether. Suffering is pain times resistance. Acceptance is the opposite of resistance, if you will. So by accepting the pain, we diminish our suffering.
Wonderfully put. And there are two more pillars to this process, but we're going to take a short break now. We are speaking about the GAIN method for dealing with stress with Dr. Greg Hammer, and we'll be right back. What do Thomas Jefferson, Elias Howe, and Paul McCartney have in common? They all understood the value of dreams, and as a result, the ideas, inventions, and creations from their dreams affect us to this day. What great ideas are you leaving on your pillow at night? Sign up for a complimentary consultation at my website, thedreamcoach.net, and discover why your dreams are a terrible thing to waste.
Welcome back to Dream Power Radio with your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman.
Yes, welcome back to Dream Power Radio. I'm your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman, and we're talking about dealing with stress with Dr. Greg Hammer. Well, Greg, you talked to us about the GAIN method, and we've gotten through the G and the A. So let's now get to I. Telling me what I signifies.
The I stands for intention, Debbie. And if we're not intentional or purposeful about the way we live and indeed the way we think, we will be stuck in this negativity and this excessive distraction with the past and the future. You know, a lot of people talk about mindfulness these days. And in fact, I credit Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who's truly one of my heroes, with bringing mindfulness into the culture in the United States and around the world. And Dr. Kabat-Zinn defined mindfulness as the experience of the present moment or awareness of the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. And the reason it has to be on purpose is because, as I've alluded to, our default way of thinking, the way our brains have become wired over the millennia, is to have this negativity bias and this distraction with the past and the future in ways that are maladaptive. So if we just go to our default way of thinking, the way our brains work, we have this negativity bias, we have this obsession with the past and future. So if we want to change the way we think, and fortunately our brains have this neuroplasticity, we have to be intentional about it. So what does that mean? That means going back to the GAIN principles. These are all interrelated. And when we're feeling negative, when we're catastrophizing, when we're feeling anxious, to first of all recognize that, and then intentionally go to gratitude, go to acceptance, recognize through gratitude perhaps that we can have a positive way of thinking. Let's look at this thing that's causing us pain or anxiety purposefully in a positive way. Let's look at the positive elements and let's be grateful for that. So this is, again, pointing to the need to be purposeful or intentional about the way we think. And if we do this in very small steps with a daily practice, after several months, we can look back and be amazed at how much more positively our brains are working and how much happier we are. And this is through the power of intention and our brain's neuroplasticity.
Okay, well, N could stand for neuroplasticity, but I know it means something else. So let's finish the word GAIN.
Non-judgment. And again, Dr. Kabat-Zinn included that in his definition of mindfulness. That is awareness of the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. And as you know, Debbie, our brains are always comparing and assessing everything in our environment. So things that we see in our environment, people that we encounter, our default mode, we're automatically going to judgment. Oh, that person is smarter than I am, or I'm better looking than that person. We're always comparing things. And in fact, we're just spinning our wheels. We're wasting our mind's energy. There's no need to compare ourselves to other people or, one friend to another person or things in the environment to other things in the environment. This is just really kind of a waste of energy, and it exhausts us. And because of our negativity bias, in fact, we tend to judge ourselves most harshly. And we tend to be negative judges of everything, in fact. So the good news is, again, by practicing non-judgment on purpose, we can gradually overcome this negative way of judging ourselves and others. And again, baby steps, daily practice, So we do our gain practice in the morning. We open our eyes, we go out in the world, and we remind ourselves to be non-judgmental. So we're driving to work, and the car in the right lane in front of us pulls over into our lane without using their turn signal and cuts us off. And we immediately start judging the other driver. He's a bad driver. He's inconsiderate. He's one negative thing after another. And then we can catch ourselves and a light bulb goes off and, hey, we're being non-judgmental. We don't have to judge this person. Who knows why they're in a hurry? Maybe they are being inconsiderate, but so be it. We're all like that sometimes. Let it go. Just take a breath and let go of that judgment. And it makes us happier. It brings us more into the present moment. So non-judgment is key.
It is key. It's also a little hard to do because most people, like you said, we compare things all the time. And I know me, myself included, and other people I know have always been our worst enemies. So
yes.
It's a hard one to tackle. So do you have any advice on how to, because just saying I'm going to be non-judgmental doesn't really work. How can you make that mind shift?
First of all, let's recognize that we're all alike. We're all judgmental by default. And if we want to become non-judgmental, it's baby steps. We're still going to find ourselves judging others and ourselves negatively. But there are a number of exercises we can do. We can, while we're breathing with our eyes closed during our gain meditation, recognize that this process of judging brings us away from the present moment. It brings us away from being positive. And so we can intentionally try to just let that thought go and laugh at ourselves. And another way of perhaps dealing with our judgmental nature is to do sort of a cognitive behavioral exercise. So the next time we find ourselves judging ourselves very harshly, let's pretend that we're talking to a good friend. So you and I, Debbie, are talking to each other instead of me talking to myself and judging myself so harshly. If my friend Debbie told me, oh, I said this thing yesterday, I'm really embarrassed about it. I self-esteem is at a new low. I just really made a blunder in public. If you were telling me about that episode, how would I react? I would support you. I would say, Debbie, you're such a beautiful person. We all say things that we don't mean, or things come out wrong, or even if we did mean it, there's no reason to be embarrassed about it. We're all imperfect. So we go through this exercise. The next time I'm judging myself for something I did or said that embarrassed me, just pretend I'm having a conversation with a friend and recognize that I would not judge that friend negatively at all. So why should I judge myself harshly? And this kind of brings into focus, I think, the lack of utility in self-judgment. And it helps us let go of that self-judgment.
You talk about the gain method being a meditation. So how do you put it together in a meditation? Just give me an example of the way you would do that.
Sure. Well, many people think, Debbie, as you know, that meditation is something that has to be practiced while we're sitting in a particular position, perhaps not a very comfortable one. We're not supposed to move our bodies for 30 minutes at a time, and we should banish all thoughts from our brain. And of course, this is really a misunderstanding, a mischaracterization of what meditation is. Meditation takes many, many forms. And because it's not practical for us to eliminate all thoughts from our head, I thought, well, why not give people something actually to focus their thoughts on? Let's just go ahead and allow thoughts to be in our consciousness during this period. And we don't need to sit in a particular position. Sit in a comfortable chair. Sit on the floor if you prefer. And we're not going to take 30 minutes. Let's start with just 3 minutes. So 3 minutes of a mindfully guided contemplative meditation is what I practice and teach. And so we get up in the morning, we open the blinds, we do our morning hygiene, we find a comfortable place to sit, we assume a seated position, we sit up straight, we close our eyes, we focus on our breath, we slow it down, we think of the magic of the air entering our nose and filling our chest, expanding our bodies, and then releasing without any effort at all. and we do this a couple of times, it actually slows our heart rate as well as our breathing rate, lowers the amount of adrenaline in our body. And then we simply go through 30 or 45 seconds each of the gain elements. We go to our gratitude. I'm grateful for this breath. I'm grateful that my breathing is unlabored. I'm grateful for the health that I have, for the wealth that I have, all being relative, of course. I'm grateful for my loved ones, and we can picture some of them. And then we move on to acceptance, intention, and non-judgment. And then we return to our breath, focusing on the slow inspiration, a pause, and exhalation without effort. And then we slowly open our eyes and we're ready to go out into the world. So this is not something I incorporate into some other form of meditation, but rather this contemplative, brief period of what I call a gain meditation is self-defining.
And I tell you, 3 minutes is a lot easier for somebody to handle and even consider than if you said, oh, if you have to do it for 30 minutes or an hour or whatever. A lot of people might not want to handle it, but everybody's got 3 minutes. They can find it someplace. Well, Dr. Greg, you're trained as a pediatric physician. So what got you interested in mindfulness?
I think, Debbie, that I've always wondered about the universe and how the universe, from the very submicroscopic, from the quantum level, interacts, the smallest particles and subparticles interact with each other to, form matter, and the way energy and matter interact. And then I thought, well, the human body is very similar. We have these very microscopic subcellular ingredients, if you will, that make up our cells, that make up our tissues, organs, and our body, the way everything is interrelated. So that is how I got into human biology and medicine. And then I decided to go to medical school. And while I was doing my clinical rotations, when I was doing a pediatric rotation, I just felt a kinship to the other people that were working with children. It wasn't initially a love of children per se. It was, I feel a kinship with this other physician or nurse who's working with children. They don't take themselves too seriously. They seem to be actually enjoying their jobs. So I decided to go in that direction. And then I was drawn to intensive care and anesthesiology. And so I ended up pursuing those paths of training. And I've never looked back. I consider myself extremely fortunate. I love my job. I love my patients. I love my coworkers. I love being in an institution at Stanford where everybody's rowing in the same direction. It's extremely gratifying and a privilege to be doing what I do. I'm very lucky.
Well, that is wonderful. We've reached just the end of the program, so time for my final question. How can people find out more about you and your work?
They can go to my website, which is greghammermd.com, GREGHAMMERMD.com. There's a lot of media there and a lot of material of interest. And hopefully this chat we're having will be up there soon.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being on Dream Power Radio today.
My pleasure, Debbie.
Okay, we've been speaking about how to reduce stress with Dr. Greg Hammer. We hope you've enjoyed today's program. If you have, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on any future podcasts. Until next time, this is Debbie Spector-Weissman saying, sweet dreams, everybody.
You've been listening to Dream Power Radio with your host, Debbie Spector-Weissman. For more information on Debbie or to sign up for her newsletter, go to dreampowerradio.com. This has been Dream Power Radio on the amazing Women and Men of Power Network, the world's leading positive programming network, powered by Raven International.